Okay, hello everyone. Looks like we're connected. Just about ready to start. Hopefully my internet holds up. The weather is very heavy here today. It's raining pretty heavily right now. And I have a satellite connection, so it sometimes goes off in bad weather. So if I disappear, that's the reason why. But at the moment, it seems good. Okay, we'll start. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato sama sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato sama sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato sama sambuddhassa. Okay, so we're continuing on with the series on the five aggregates, and today I'm going to speak about Saññā, perception, which is actually an important topic and a big one and a subtle one. It's something that I think it's really important to understand the nature of perception in order to break the grip of delusion. Saññā is compared in that series of metaphors as the body is a sea foam, feelings are bubbles. Saññā, or perception, is compared to a mirage in the desert. And actually, it's not only a metaphor. A mirage in the desert is a very good example of Saññā in operation. You'll notice in the Satipatthana Sutta, the four foundations of mindfulness, each of the four corresponds more or less to one of the aggregates, except perception is left out. And I think the reason for this is that perception is so subtle and so intimately linked with with another of the aggregates, vijnana, or consciousness, that it's very difficult, in most cases practically impossible, to observe it separately. So it's not really a suitable object for directed mindfulness, but we need to understand it. So what is Saññā? What is perception? What does it do? We'll have to jump forward a little bit to say something about the aggregate of consciousness. When we experience any object in the external world through the physical senses, we're receiving data from the outer universe. In the case of sight, we're receiving light, wavelengths of light, radiation. With sound, it's vibration in the ears, and so on. There's a kind of stream of information or data coming in from the outer world through these five senses, which are graphically represented by windows in a house. So these signals are just raw information, and they come into the mind and are then parsed and made sense of and categorized, named, and so on by the faculty of Saññā, perception. To take the example of sight, sight or vision does not see an apple. Say there's a red apple sitting on the table. Vision does not see an apple. Vision sees only color and shape. It sees only round and red. And Saññā takes that information and says, oh yeah, that's an apple. And it presents an apple as a finished product to further down the stream of consciousness, so that what we perceive on the what we cognize or sense through the senses is red and round, but what we perceive is an apple. So we have the illusion that we're looking at an apple. What this means in a metaphysical sense is that we never actually experience the outer universe directly. What we actually experience, the world we live in, is not the natural universe. It's a simulation of that, constructed by Saññā. Now, if we are mentally healthy, we're not insane and hallucinating, and if our sense organs are in reasonably good order, the simulation will be accurate enough that we can move in the external world and manipulate objects and deal with things. It's a useful simulation. It's not an utter illusion, but it's the best that we can do with in an incarnate form, in a physical body. We're limited in our intake of information by the senses. And Saññā is the faculty that deals with the sense data and creates a world. Now, this is important to understand to get over a kind of naive realism that is one of the ways in which we easily fall into delusion. To get over the sense that we're actually seeing an apple, we're experiencing or perceiving an apple, which is a creative act on the part of our mind, through the faculty of Saññā, taking the sense information and creating an apple out of it. So the actual world we experience is an interplay, is an interchange between the external universe and our own creative faculties in Saññā. And Saññā does have this creative aspect, which we can demonstrate. I like to cite a common example, something that I think everyone will be familiar with. At some point in your life, you probably were relaxing out of doors, looking at a blue sky with some clouds, and just letting the mind play in the shape of the clouds. And if you do it with a relaxed mind and a kind of playful attitude, you can see all kinds of shapes, faces and animals and all sorts of things in the clouds. And they can actually become quite detailed and realistic. And obviously, you're not changing the clouds with your mind. The clouds, this mass of water vapor, is unaffected by your little game. But your faculty of Saññā is being given some free rein by your relaxed attitude and saying, okay, it's as if you were saying, okay, we don't really need to perceive these clouds as they actually are 100%. So kind of have some fun with this one, use your creative faculties and make something interesting out of it. And Saññā does that all the time to some degree. And this is how a great many optical illusions work, for example. Saññā will often make an effort to fill in the gaps, to complete a picture that's only partially perceived. So there are optical illusions, for example, where there's a repeated pattern, but there's maybe like intersecting lines with circles where they intersect. But at one point in the pattern, there's a break. The circle is missing, and you'll see it if you direct your vision intently right at that corner where the break is. But if you look elsewhere, your peripheral vision will fill in the circle, and you'll see it complete. The pattern is complete. That's Saññā filling in the gaps, acting creatively. When we dream at night, Saññā is given even more free rein than in the cloud example. In our waking life, our Saññā is trying to operate within tight constraints of the actual sense information coming in, and mostly strives to present an accurate simulation. But at night, sleeping, in the dream state, the incoming sense information is cut off. So Saññā is operating only on scraps of memory and imagination, and creating a whole world out of that. And you can see the power of Saññā in dreaming. Some dreams are very fantastic and realistic and detailed. And this is the power of Saññā, working with next to nothing and creating an entire world out of it. So there's a sense in which when we're awake and dealing with the waking world, we're also dreaming it into existence. But we're dreaming it into existence on a strict set of parameters. The wavelengths of light, the vibrations in the air, and so on, are limiting what Saññā can do, so that Saññā ends up trying to simulate the external world. But it's the same process. Saññā is still working in the same way in waking and dreaming. The difference is only in the lack of sense information. And Saññā operates very quickly upon that sense information. This is why it's really hard to know or experience Saññā directly, because it's so tied up with sense impression. So when we look at the apple, we really have a feeling. It intuitively feels like we're looking at an apple, where we're seeing an apple. But there's a tiny fraction of a second where we're only seeing the color red and round shape before the apple is created in our mind. In meditations, if you're doing Vipassana meditation and it's going very well, and the mind is very quick in the noticing, sometimes it's possible for a person to make that distinction more with sound than with sight. With sight, it's more difficult, but with sound, sometimes you can get that sense. For example, you hear a bird singing outside. Normally, we would think and say that we hear a bird, but we actually do not. We hear a loud, high-pitched, repetitive sound, and the mind recognizes it, perceives it as birdsong. And it seems that with the sound, the gap may be slightly greater. So sometimes it's possible to see that, to just hear the sound before perceiving the bird. And this is actually in Vipassana meditation. We should be striving always to get down to the bare roots of experience, of actual experience, to get to the most fundamental level of the immediacy of mind taking an object. And if someone hears high-pitched sound before perceiving bird, then that's very good. That's a sign that they're really seeing the process at a fine grain. And perception can also cause us to fall into delusion in different ways. One of the classic examples that comes up in some of the old texts is mistaking the rope for a snake. A person is walking on a trail in the forest, and at dusk the light is not good. Someone's left a piece of rope on the trail, and they see it, they perceive a snake. And this is very easy to understand experience. And many of you may have had some similar, maybe not exactly that one, but misperceiving something, at least momentarily, as something dangerous. Because our mind is in that situation. You're walking on a trail in a place with poisonous snakes, and at dusk, your mind is hyper vigilant for snakes. And if the perception is working with a very limited sense data from sight, and it sees that the vision coming in of a piece of rope that's only partially seen because of poor light, the perception fills it in as a snake. And for a moment, it might be quite realistic, a quite realistic looking snake, until you focus on it and look at it more clearly as, oh, that's just a piece of rope. So part of wisdom and living sensibly and well is not to always trust your perceptions. What you perceive is not necessarily actually real. It's just your perception. It's what you have to deal with. And this can impact on interpersonal relations. And it's a common phenomena that people that we're perceiving this is the quality of perception, of filling in the gaps. Perception wants to present a full picture, and if the information it's working with is incomplete, it will fill in the gaps as best it can, and it can sometimes then be incorrect and lead to misinterpretation and to problems. So be ready to doubt your perceptions. Understand them as just a play of the mind. And your perceptions can be educated and refined. This is another quality of perception. An example might be someone looks at a patch of ground that's covered in weeds, and another person looks at it, but that person has been trained in botany, and he perceives much more detail. He's able to recognize species, and he's able to make judgments about the quality of the environment and so on. Where someone who's not interested so much in plants, had never studied them, just a bunch of weeds. So perception can be refined and educated. This is part of the process of a baby growing up and learning language and so on. This language is tied into perception because we name things, then it's an aspect of perceiving. And we're able to categorize things because we have language and we name them. And a child growing up from infancy to a more mature state has to develop all those things gradually. And we can continue that to some degree throughout our entire life, refining our perceptions. And perception can also be tied into a quality of judgment, that we can perceive something as desirable or beautiful, or we can perceive it as fearful and ugly. And it might be two people have these different perceptions about the same object. Part of that is focusing on different signs and particulars, taking different aspects of a complex object and focusing on them. And then that can change the whole perception, the feel of the entire object. So returning to that initial metaphor, I'll just finish with this, that to analyze that a little bit, the mirage in the desert. Say someone is traveling in the desert and they're hungry and thirsty, and so there's a strong desire in the mind for shade and water. And the heat in the air causes what do they call it, when the air is wavy? I forget the technical name for it. The air becomes sort of shimmering from the heat, and that's an unusual sort of a visual phenomena presented to eye consciousness. And eye consciousness, unless the eyes are damaged, it doesn't contaminate the vision. It presents what it gets, and that's passed on to Saññā. And Saññā is working now with very limited information of this unusual phenomenon of shimmering air, and it motivated by desire for water and shade, it sees an oasis with palm trees and pools of water. So it's very easily understandable in terms of the analysis of the aggregates how desert mirages work. The same way dreams work is the same way our experience of clouds, shapes in clouds work. And it's actually what's happening with ordinary day-to-day consciousness of external objects, except in that in most cases the presentation is that Saññā comes up with is reasonably effective and accurate, and we can work with it. But we should remember that it's only a simulation. It's not an actual reality. Okay, so I'll stop there and go on to answering questions. Let's see, it looks like there's already people jumping into the chat. Like the signs in the subway, mind the gap. Need to practice that with perception too, how perception fills in the gap. Yeah, that's pretty good. Yeah, mind the gap. Where is memory classified the 5 aggregates? Is it mental formation or an aspect of perception? That is actually a very interesting question. Memory, I think, works with different aggregates. The content of memory is presented to consciousness as a sankhara, as a mental formation. It was originally an object that was perceived at a previous time through the 5 senses and perception. And how it, where it's stored, how it occurs is a bit mysterious, but the way it's perceived in the moment is as a mental formation, a dhamma in the mind. Uh, how do I scroll up this chat? Okay, I got it. Um, how does one see one's own past lives? Is it through the jhanas? Uh, if so, it must be in first jhana, because with second jhana, there's no sankhara. The perception of past lives can happen spontaneously, and I think it happens actually more often than people realize in fragments of dream and dreaming at night. Um, that those memories still exist. Uh, it's only a question of accessing them, of knowing them. Um, there is a practice for developing past life memory that's outlined in the Visuddhimagga, but it sounds like a very difficult, demanding exercise. You can look it up for details, but the basic idea is that you run your memory backwards through the day, trying to recount in as fine a detail as you can everything you've done today, back to the morning, and then you keep doing that in subsequent sessions, uh, pushing the memory further and further back, uh, going through the time more quickly, but trying to catch as much detail as you can, the past week, past month, past year, all the way back to your childhood and then to your moment of birth. And then you push it back through the womb into the previous death and back in the previous life. But it's the idea, the theory is you're creating a continuous chain of memory. So you're linking it moment by moment. So it sounds very difficult and demanding. Um, I don't know anyone who's ever really seriously tried it. Could Saññā be somehow compared to short-term memory, which hold bits of information for a brief span of time, typically a few seconds? Um, yeah, I could see that. I could see that as a parallel there, or a close linkage. That the information coming in from the senses is worked on very quickly by Saññā. It would be much less than a few seconds. It's almost instantaneous, but there is a very short fraction of a second gap where there's just sense perception, and then Saññā makes sense of it. So Saññā is actually perceiving something from the past, albeit the very recent past, fraction of a second in the past. Perception and feeling arise at the same time, or do they interdependent like Namarupa and Vijnana? Feeling actually occurs subsequent to perception. It's first we cognize the object with the senses, then we perceive it, and then it's felt as being pleasant or unpleasant. So with Saññā, do we start to see the first appearance of language among the aggregates? Well, Saññā works with language, and but language per se is actually mental formation. But it's an interplay between those two factors, because part of perceiving something is being able to name it. If it's nameless, it's not fully perceived. It's sort of vague in the mind. So Saññā has a role in language, but language itself is primarily mental formation. The practice seems to have me step back from the world and watch my mind's activity. Would this be a fair assessment of practice? Yeah, that would be one way of understanding it that would work, sure. What is the best way to educate your perception in relation to the path? With perceiving the breath in different ways during meditation, the ways that Janli and Tanesero Bhikkhu recommend work well. Yeah, that that is one that is one practice that works with perception directly. That meditation's taught by those Bhantes to uh, work with the perception of breath. If you were monastic and meat was offered you but didn't accept it and would rather starve, would that clinging to not wanting to eat meat prevent you from enlightenment? Well, Theravada monks were not required to be vegetarian. We can eat meat if it's offered to us. There are some restrictions on that. The animal has to have not been killed specifically for the monk, and there are also 10 meats that are forbidden, although they're not ones that usually come up in practice, like elephant, snake, dog, human flesh. There's a list of meats that are not allowed, but they're not common ones. And the general practice, the general spirit of the practice of the eating for the monks is to not be fussy, to take what's given, and to not make difficulties. Um, so if a monk, out of his own choice, decided to be vegetarian, but he couldn't get enough to eat, then that would be kind of on him. He would not be. It would not really be proper for him to demanding that other people um, cater to his preferences. What's the difference between Vijnana and Chitta? I plan to talk on that in the session on Vijnana, because that's actually a very involved topic. Not really don't really want to give a brief answer here, because I'm going to try and treat it a bit more seriously in 2 weeks' time when we deal with Vijnana. In some religions, people sacrifice animals to the gods. Do they make bad karma doing that? Is enough to make them go to Naraya? Well, it is definitely considered by Buddhism to be bad karma, and it's compounded. It's a worse karma because it's done with wrong view. Whether it's enough to make them go to Naraya, we cannot answer definitively. We don't know. It would certainly. We can never judge ahead of time the full impact of karmas, but it would certainly tend that direction. Greetings from India, Ajahn. Questions. In the Maha Vidalya Sutta, Venerable Sariputta says, Saññā, when Vedana and Vijnana are co-joined, does that mean they're always together and are by some definitions the same thing? They're co-joined in that they always occur as a group. You can't really have Saññā without Vijnana. You can't have Vedana without the other two. They inevitably occur together, but they're not the same thing. They're separate faculties of mind, and they're part of the process of fully discerning an object. Are they ever separated? In eighth jhana, for example, is Saññā ever reliable of knowledge of ultimate reality? They're never really fully separated. You can't really experience any of those three without the other two in play. Even in the higher jhanas, they're still as subtle. That's why the last or the eighth jhana is called neither perception nor non-perception, neva saññā na saññā, because you can't say there's perception in the ordinary sense, because there's really nothing to perceive, but you can't say there's no perception either, because there's still a very subtle way that process is still happening. Uh, and the second part of the question is the ever a reliable source of knowledge of ultimate reality. Um, I would say no, but not categorically. I think that particularly if we're going to talk about the highest reality, the unconditioned, it's impossible to really understand it in terms of categories of ordinary reality. So it's any sort of answer doesn't apply there. Um, because there's always with Saññā, there's always some quality of creation involved. Now, it may be with very clear vision and very advanced mind that the Saññā will be extremely sharp and accurate and good, but there's always going to be that tiny sliver of difference between a reality and a perceived reality. So everything we experience in the world is conditioned by the mind. Is that correct? Yes, it is. I would even go a little bit further and say that we never really experience the world. Uh, what we experience is our simulation of the world. We're living in a dream, but that dream, in most cases, will be a reasonably accurate portrayal of the actual reality, but it's not the reality. As you say, Saññā is hard to observe directly, but we can understand it and refine and change it over time. What are some of the beginning ways to develop the mind in order to do this? Um, one practice is to work with the coarser levels of perception first, which is the kind of judgmental attitude. For example, if you see something that you initially perceive as being ugly, make an effort to change the perception and see the beauty in it, and or vice versa, to um, try and flip the perception of things around. Do arahants dream and do they remember them? Off topic, what does your mug say? Oh, the mug is just didn't even remember where I got it. It's a giveaway mug from some local radio station. It's nothing significant to me. Do arahants dream? Uh, yeah, that there is some debate about that. Um, I think that was one of the topics that's debated in the Katuwatu. I believe that the general consensus is that they can dream, but that is controversial. Is the perception of dewas different from humans and so on? Yes. In fact, there's one interpretation that was uh, from Mahayana source, from Dogen's Rivers and Mountains Sutra, which is very beautiful text, uh, where he maintained that the entire difference between the realms is perception. And he gives the example of a river. To a human being, it's swift flowing water. To a being in hell, it's molten lava. And to a naga, it's crystal palaces. And the actual external physical reality is not changed, but it's entirely a quality of perception. Um, I could also say that in the Dewa realms, their experience is much more fluid. We would say like magical or miraculous, and I think that's a result of the perception for Dewas is probably the quality of Saññā is probably somewhere in between our dreaming and our waking states. That it's still dealing with an external reality, but has much more fluidity and much more. The creative aspect is much stronger. And then when you get up to uh, the fifth heaven, the uh, Nimanarati Devas, the Devas of delight in creation, it's like a continuous lucid dream that they essentially create the world that they live in continuously. And this would be a very powerful use of perception. Does forgetting our past memories happen instantly at death, or is it gradually forgotten through the embryonic stage? I think the general feeling is that it happens more or less gradually, um, and that I do recall that for Dewas they can generally remember their immediate past life. That when if they came from the human realm to the Deva realm, they can remember their human life. And it's said that the reason for that is that the birth process is not traumatic for them. They just appear fully formed. They don't go through a long embryonic stage and then a traumatic birth experience, which would seem to be the reason that we don't recall our past lives because of that prolonged and difficult experience. Uh, I remember reading a sutta: contact is condition for feeling. What you feel, you perceive. So I always confuse about perception and feeling. Yeah, there is an interrelationship between perception and feeling that can work both ways. Um, Ordinarily, the feeling comes subsequently to the perception, but we can the feeling can also modify perception, which is what I'm talking about when you try and see the beauty in something that you initially perceive as ugly. Then you change the perception, you change the feeling. Um, so you can change your perception by flipping the feelings around, or vice versa. Do Brahmins have perception? Yes, they do. Brahmas, yeah, yes, they have all the mental faculties. So is Nibbana the real reality? Well, it is a real reality. Uh, question of what is real and how you define real is a philosophical issue. But in Abhidhamma, there's a principle that there's four fundamental realities, and that's matter, physical form, consciousness, mental objects, and Nibbana. Do beings in Arupa realm have thought process? If so, what? Because there's no sankhara after second jhana, or is it just exhaustion of the kama? I would, yeah, I think you're correct. There's no there's not, it's not actually, you're not actually 100% correct. It's not that there's no sankhara after second jhana. There's no vitaka vichara, which is a subset. So there's no manipulation of objects in that way that we recognize as thought and speech. That doesn't occur. Um, so what the mind stream of a being in the formless realm is like is difficult to say. There would not definitely not be thought uh, as we perceive it. What would they think about? They don't have any sense organs. Um, it would have to be entirely internally generated. Uh, I think it's one of those questions that's really kind of beyond our ability to answer. How are some Brahmas unified in perception? Yeah, this is citing a sutta that talks about some different classes of beings as being unified in different ways. Uh, um, I actually don't remember that detail, honestly. There is some technical point about that. Uh, how can we use the faculty of perception in the right way in samatha meditation practice? Practical advice would help, Bhante. Well, whatever the object of the samatha meditation is, say that it's breath. We'll take that as the simplest example. You're trying to sense the physical sense of touch at the nose tip, and perception should be just dealing with the sense of touch. So it's you're keeping it on a very tight sort of leash. You're not letting it wander. You're being uh, you're only paying attention to one sense base, so that you're not giving perception a lot to work with. So you don't want to. If you're trying to develop that samatha, you want that all your faculties, including the senses and the perception and mental formations, all to be focused on that single object and not wandering away from it. Okay, so I think we'll stop there for today, and next week we're doing sankharas, and, we'll carry on with this series. Okay, thank you all for coming, and see you next time. And I'm glad my internet connection held out. I was a little bit worried about that.